1987. This is arguably the most important year we've looked at so far. This year had the launch of the PC Engine in Japan, the system that would be known as the TurboGrafx in the West. It had the launch of Contra, Metal Gear, and Street Fighter, some of the most iconic video games of all time. I think RPGs especially owe a special thanks to the year of 1987, as it was one of the most revolutionary years and gave us some of our greatest series. In December of '87, the most important RPG series of all time began, when Square released Final Fantasy. Square was facing bankruptcy at the time, and this was meant to be their final game, hence the name Final Fantasy. However, the success of this game would not only keep the developer alive, it would allow them to thrive and create some of the best RPGs that we know today. Final Fantasy is widely regarded as being one of the most important RPGs as it popularized the genre. Critics of the time were amazed by the game's graphics. This has become a franchise staple. While Final Fantasy didn't necessarily introduce many new features, it did an excellent job at perfecting many existing ones. Some things that really separated Final Fantasy apart from its competitors was the level of detail in its story and the wide array of classes to choose from. Over the years, this game has been released on numerous systems, and to date has sold over 3 million copies across all those. Amazingly enough, Square wasn't even going to develop this game until they saw the success of one of our previous games reviewed, Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest showed them and other developers that games like RPGs could be successful on a massive scale. They would no longer be relegated to the niche genre that they were in the past. And games like Final Fantasy not only took what Dragon Quest did, but definitely expanded that and really made the genre what it is today. I think every single RPG coming forward owes at least some credit to the Final Fantasy series and to Square itself. The second RPG I want to talk about in '87 was Phantasy Star, which was Sega's trademark RPG. Of course, this launched in '87 and was set up in direct competition to Final Fantasy. Phantasy Star was much like Final Fantasy in its praise for its beautiful graphics, deep story, and combat style. At this time, Phantasy Star was one of the only story-driven games in the West, and would shape the way that games were thought of in this area of the world. Phantasy Star, much like the Metroid series, was one of the first games to feature a female lead character, something that we see a lot more of today, something I think is very important to the development of video games. The defining characteristic of Phantasy Star has to be its use of 3D graphics. At this time, very few games, if any, were actually using 3D graphics, and this game was able to master that in its dungeons, something that critics loved. It's also widely regarded as one of the best examples of using detailed sprites in its enemies. At this time, many of the enemies were seen as kind of secondary characteristics or secondary characters and didn't get the same kind of detail that the actual story-driven characters had. But this changed for many people. Some of the combat you see in these clips is just phenomenal for the time, and it's hard to believe it even came out in this year. It's unfortunate, but Phantasy Star has kind of been forgotten over the last few years. We've only seen one actual new game in the last 10 years, which was Phantasy Star Nova, which actually does look like an amazing game, but unfortunately it was a Japan-only game. But nonetheless, RPGs owe a lot to Phantasy Star. It's understandable if you've never heard of the Dungeon Master series, but make no mistake about it, this game has had arguably just an important role as Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star ever had, although it doesn't have the same name recognition. In its first year alone, Dungeon Master was able to sell 40,000 copies for the Atari ST, making it the Atari ST's all-time top-selling game, something that wasn't common for many RPGs to be a console or computer's top-selling game. The most notable feature about this game is its use of 3D dungeons. This is considered to be the prototype of a 3D dungeon crawler. Games like Eye of the Beholder, even games like Doom, I'm sure in some part owe some of their technique and some of their style to this game. It was that important at the time. And where most RPGs were using turn-based combat or a variation of turn-based combat in their games, this is one of the first games to implement real-time combat, something that would be definitive in the Western RPGs, and definitely holds this game as one of the groundbreakers in RPGs in the West especially. Unfortunately today, Dungeon Master doesn't have the following it once had, but it still has a loyal fan base, and this is one of the most important games in RPG history. In '87, my favorite developer or one of my favorite developers, released its definitive first game, in Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei. Unfortunately, this game was only in Japan, but it was a great sign of things to come from Atlus. Some critics did see this game as revolutionary and groundbreaking, and as a great game, but most people saw this game as a good to very good game. I've never played the game, unfortunately, so I can't comment really on that. But what I will say is that this game did establish Atlus as one of the dominant players in RPGs. It may have taken a while, but Atlus would establish itself as one of the preeminent developers, one of the game developers that would be known for creating high quality and a pretty good quantity of RPGs. From the Shin Megami Tensei series to the Persona series, Atlus is definitely seated at the top of RPG developers. Some of the things that this game did revolutionize was monster collecting, something we saw in the Pokemon series. Never before had we saw that. We also saw the first use of cyberpunk aesthetics, something that has become widely popular. And this game was actually, this series was actually the third most popular RPG series in Japan, only behind the incredible Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series. So while this game may not have been the greatest RPG of all time, it definitely holds its place as one of the most important RPGs of all time. In '87, Japan got the sequel to The Legend of Zelda, and The Legend of Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. Very few games on this list, and very few games in general, have the same type of criticism that this game gets. Although this game wouldn't be released until '89 in America, many people nowadays see this game as kind of a betrayal of the Legend of Zelda series. But it's important to note at this time there was no set specific format for what a Zelda game would play like. And this was a incredibly unique game at the time. One of the very few RPGs to be set on a side-scrolling fashion. Something that was completely different than the first game, and something I think a lot of people weren't expecting. Zelda fans should give this game credit for introducing a lot of staples for the series. Things like non-playable characters became much bigger in this game than they were in the original. Other things like the Dark Link character, a franchise staple, is something that was first introduced in this game. We also saw a greater depth of detail in this game than we saw in the original Zelda. Something a lot of people don't give this game credit for, but this game truly was an amazing game and one of the most important games in Zelda history. Another game that unfortunately has been a little bit forgotten is the magic of Shirahare. I'm sure I butchered that name, so forgive me. But definitely a game that has an important place in RPG history. Now this was a very innovative game. Much like The Legend of Zelda, this helped make a sort of hybrid between the action-adventure series and the RPG series, something we saw a lot more of in the future. Another feature that was pretty unique for this game was featuring two separate combat styles. We saw real-time combat, and we also saw turn-based combat. Not many games are able to successfully implement two different styles of combat. Games that do come to mind like Nier Automata. And the games that can master that really have something special, and this game was able to do that pretty well. This was one of the first RPGs to take place in the Middle East. Something we didn't really see before, or haven't seen much since. So credit to them for doing that, it's pretty cool. This game also came over to North America. Unfortunately, it was kind of a dumbed down version, hence the game never saw the success in the West that it got in Japan. And this game was planning a sequel, but poor sales in the West did ultimately end that, creating this as the only game in the series. And what an amazing game it was, though, and a very important game to the history of RPG. '87 also did see some pretty important things outside of the RPG world. We saw the launch of the Mega Man series, and the beloved Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Obviously one of the most popular games of all time. But overall, '87 truly was an amazing year in RPGs, an amazing year in gaming, and I do want to give you guys a massive, massive thanks if you made it all the way to the end, for everyone who supports the channel. It really encourages me to keep making these videos. These history videos, they take a while to make, so if you guys could give me a positive comment or subscribe to my channel, I would really, really appreciate it, guys. Again, peace out, Blue Suns.